Of Vannevar Bush, an admirer has said, "I always think of him as a Cape Codder. His roots are deep in the soil of that historic bit of sterile land, and metaphorically speaking, his shoes are full of its sand." In this summary, we can glimpse the force and crisp character of the man. During the last 40 years, Dr. Bush has been one of the nation's leaders in the great onrush of science and engineering. Today, in the workshop at his home in Belmont, Massachusetts, he is still busy working at his hobbies and the newest of his long list of inventions. Of these, he is best known for his analytical machines, which were pioneers in the evolution of computer technology. Dr. Bush has served as Dean of the School of Engineering at MIT and now is honorary chairman of the MIT Corporation. As an administrator of scientific research, he guided the work of the Carnegie Institution for 17 years. Throughout the years, he has also applied his know-how to industry. He was one of the founders of the Raytheon Manufacturing Company, and he has been chairman of the board of Merck & Company. Today on Science Reporter, we are going to look back over the years with this extraordinary man and share his views on some of the great events of his time. Hello, I'm John Fitch, MIT Science Reporter. We're at the home of Dr. Vannevar Bush in Belmont, Massachusetts. During World War II, Dr. Bush was the organizer, guiding spirit, and driving force of our nation's scientific efforts in a global conflict. As director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, he was responsible for mobilizing the forces which produced many of the technological advances that played an important part in the winning of the war. Dr. Bush worked closely with Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, and in effect was the first of our scientific advisors. He shared the enormous responsibility for the development and use of our most fearsome weapon, the atomic bomb. Let's meet Dr. Bush.
John, good to have you here.
Well, Dr. Bush, this is certainly a beautiful home that you have here.
I think it's a very nice one. We built it soon after the war, some 8 years ago, soon after I came up from Washington 8 years ago, and it's worked out very well.
Well, let's start off by going back to 1945 in New Mexico when you witnessed the first atomic bomb blast. What was your personal reaction then?
Well, of course, my first reaction was one of great relief that the program had been successful and the bomb had gone off on schedule.
Well, now, when you go look back from a vantage point of 18 years, do you have any regrets about it?
No. Of course, President Truman made the decision to use the bomb, but I thought then, and I think now, that he was right, for a number of reasons. One, by ending the war abruptly, it saved 100,000 or more American casualties. It saved the lives of Japanese, for that matter. Then, too, the bomb was bound to appear, and I think it as well that it appeared in a dramatic fashion, so that civilization would face up to it, as it wouldn't have if it had come in some test fag. And the world has got to live with it and had to learn to live with it. I also think that it's well that the bomb came into effect in our hands, not in the hands of some other country, perhaps Russia.
Now, what might have been some of the alternatives to developing a bomb?
Well, you hear people say today that everything would be lovely if there were no A-bomb, if we could abolish it. What happened was not the production of an A-bomb simply, it was the modern application of science and engineering to warfare. If we had no A-bombs today, we might be thoroughly worried about the possible advent of, let's say, biological warfare, which in my opinion is a more horrible thing and a much more threatening thing to civilization, fortunately pushed in the background today.
Well, now, what about other weapons of warfare at that time? There were some that were pretty devastating in addition to the bomb.
Oh, yes. The fire raids on Tokyo were much more horrible than any A-bomb on Nagasaki. They killed many innocent people in terrible circumstances. Yet I heard no protests on the use of fire bombs because they were accepted.
Standard weapons, conventional weapons.
Conventional weapons.
I've read, too, that many of the scientists and engineers working on the bomb had moral qualms about it at the time. Was there any evidence of a struggle about this?
No, some had qualms, and those were expressed very carefully to Secretary Stimson and to President Truman. And every protest of that sort was further followed through. But there were very few who protested. I think 9 out of 10 scientists that had to do with it felt just as I did.
I would like to quote one modern writer, a man named Jacob Bronowski, who said that nothing happened in 1945 except that we changed the scale of our indifference to man. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I don't know. I don't quite understand what he's talking about, but what happened was that science, which had piled up great resources of fundamental knowledge, became suddenly applied to warfare in a very thorough way. And the result was proximity fuses and radar and 100 things. Anti-submarine weapons, direct-guided missiles, rockets. It was bound to happen. That's the thing that happened. And that's the thing that civilization has to learn to live with. The application of science produces beneficial things, and it also produces dangers to the race. The great thing that happened is that science became thus applied.
Well, don't you think it's sort of a paradox that this tremendous instrument of warfare, the greatest we've ever known, may very well be the strongest force for peace in our time?
There's no doubt that since the war, we've had a stalemate. We have today a determination on the part of Russia and ourselves not to get into an all-out war because of the A-bomb. I think we may be able to learn to live with it that way. Certainly, in my opinion, a deadlock of the sort that we have today is preferable to the situation we've had for some 3,000 or 4,000 years of continual warfare, renewed every generation, devastating and just as cruel as any war. I'm glad we're out of that sequence.
Well, as head of our wartime research efforts, you must have been very alert to what was going on in other countries. Why was it that Germany, which had been attempting to make an A-bomb, was unsuccessful?
Because their organization was wrong, and because their scientists and their military, instead of cooperating, were fighting with one another. In fact, various agencies of the German government were fighting with one another during the war as vigorously as they fought with us. Their organization was terrible. They played Hitler's hunches, and they did everything wrong.
Now, did you know this at the time?
Oh, certainly. We knew where they stood on the A-bomb at the time.
How was that possible?
Well, I can tell you. In fact, I've got a book on that I'd like to show you. Let's go into the study a moment, and I'll show you that, because it's worth looking at. It's written by a man by the name of Goudsmit, Sam Goudsmit, and the name of it is Alsace. And I think you'll find it a fascinating affair. What Goudsmit and his men found out in regard to German efforts on the A-bomb was really that they hadn't gotten to first base. Now, you asked me why. Let me give you Sam's words. The 3 German errors mentioned so far, complacency, deterioration of interest in pure science, and regimentation in the administrative control of science, are the principal ones that we too can make if we're not on guard against them. But that's a great book.
Well, now, what about the Japanese? I don't believe they were working on atomic energy, were they? But how did they do in other technical fields?
They didn't produce during the war any new weapons. They produced some new techniques of fighting and jungle fighting, but as far as any scientific application to weapons, there wasn't any.
Even their airplanes, their very high-speed
their airplanes were just copies. They're kamikaze planes.
Now, we worked pretty well with the British, didn't we, sharing...
Very well indeed. We shared all of our reports. We worked together on nearly every project and with great harmony.
Mm-hmm. What was your reaction to Churchill? I believe you had an opportunity to meet him.
Of course, I'm a great admirer of Churchill, as everyone else is. I didn't like the way that he controlled British science. And I think a good many British scientists didn't like it either. But he was a great man, of course.
What about the Russians? How were they in technical matters during World War
Well,
II?
again, nothing new in the way of weapons came out of Russia. They did enormous things in producing great masses of artillery and so forth, but no innovations that I know of that amounted to anything.
That's changed somewhat in the
Oh, yes,
intervening
changed
years.
very much, and I can tell you the reason that it's changed, and it's an interesting one. Right after the war, I said that I didn't believe that Russia would produce much in the way of science or technology. And the reason was that their laboratories were all commissar-ridden. They were politically controlled, and their programs were made up by communists who knew nothing about science. But they changed all of that a few years ago. They took their commissars out of the laboratory. They gave them their freedom. They gave them their entire opportunity to make their own programs. And the result was a great burst of scientific achievement and technological engineering achievement. It's the exuberance of newfound freedom, perhaps.
Well, in this country, World War II was certainly an important turning point for science. What about in the role of the science advisor? How has that changed over the years since then?
Well, you spoke of me as being the first presidential advisor. Actually, my post was somewhat different from that. I was advisor to the president, but my principal job was running a government agency as an executive. On the other hand, Dr. Killian and Wiesner, the ones that have fallen in since the war, have been our advisors. Now, in both cases, in their case and in mine, we've never taken this as a matter of giving personal advice. My job, their job, was to get to the President of the United States the best possible scientific advice available anywhere in the country. That's in contrast with the situation they had in Britain.
I see.
And it's one thing that I think we did right.
In the case of the British, it was the personal opinion of advisors.
His personal opinion was very important. That was not the fault of the scientists, that was the fault of Churchill. That's the way he wanted it.
I wonder if you'd care to comment on the increasing role and importance of that role of the scientist in our society and in government.
Well, of course, we see it everywhere. Science has been remaking our lives in every way. It's going to do so in the future. And it's inevitable, therefore, that scientists and engineers have far more to do with government. Then, too, we have an enormous increase in the support by government of scientific work, which means many scientists in this country are working indirectly for government.
I understand it's something like 2 out of 3.
Something of the sort. And that inevitably brings scientists in contact with government on all sorts of fronts. As appointed men, usually, in the administrative branch, the executive branch of government. Scientists and engineers don't run for Congress very much.
Yes, that's an interesting point. I wonder how they get along with congressmen.
Well,
their methods are quite different.
I know they are, and I think you'll find this, that scientists and engineers are getting along with Congress a lot better than they used to. There has been developing a mutual respect both ways. Scientists, for one thing, have discovered that the art of politics is a rather subtle art, necessary for a democracy, not a thing to be learned overnight. And the congressmen, the lawyers, and so forth, on the other hand, have found that scientists are fairly human beings. We had a similar thing during the war. When the war started, military men and scientists were just like this. At the end of the war, they had developed mutual respect and they collaborated effectively, harmonious.
Do you see any danger of a certain scientific elite gaining too much power in a situation like that?
No, I don't. I hear it mentioned every little while. Of course, there is enormous power in the hands of some scientists, such as the one who heads the National Science Foundation. But most of his decisions are made on the basis of recommendations of committees of scientists in the various fields. It's not very easy, you know, to dominate a group of scientists. They're about as independent a crowd as you could find anywhere. I'd just about as much think of dominating the scientists of this country as I would of a little clique running a faculty of a university. It isn't done.
It's impossible. Well, what about this recent study on the West Coast, I believe, which points out an alleged irresponsibility on the part of scientists who are so busy working for the military in many cases that they're really not willing to take the responsibility for what is going to result.
It is charged right along that scientists are now working for government so much that it warps their judgment, that they will recommend on the basis of what's going to make more money flow through the channel that they're connected with. There undoubtedly is some of that. There are some in every profession that would take that point of view. But in my opinion, 9 out of 10 scientists in this country asked to give their honest opinion to government for a matter that concerns the public interest, will give their honest opinion without equivocation and without slant.
And that's you feel that that's a responsibility?
I think that's their
attitude.
responsibility, and I think that's what nearly all of them will do.
Well, Dr. Bush, you spoke about the relationship of the politician to the scientist and the fact that they do get along together, do understand. What about the rather larger problem of the whole mass of our citizenry, the widening gap between science and the general public? How are they to learn more about science so that they can make intelligent decisions?
That's quite a problem. Incidentally, we keep talking about scientists. A great many of the things that we are talking about are really engineering accomplishments, and we ought to couple the two nearly every time. For example, in the atomic energy problem, after the scientists had got through, the bulk of the job was an engineering job, done by chemical engineers, electrical engineers, and so on. But to come to your question, there is a great problem to keep the American public alerted on science in a reasonable manner. Now, all of the media, television, radio, magazines, and so forth, not only help in that, but their presentation of science to the public is marvelously better than it was some years ago. It's improving all the time. And on the other hand, that is possible because the American public is acquiring an understanding. The criticism that I have is this, that the public generally, naturally enough, is likely to be beguiled principally by the spectacular. The things that, sewing a leg onto a chap who had it cut off or something, or space flights or something. Whereas they do not do the study to understand the parts that are very much more subtle.
But do you feel, as as C.P. Snow has pointed out, that there is an unbridgeable gap between the two cultures, that there's no hope for people to understand the scientist or engineer?
I disagree with C.P. Snow on that subject and on many others. There are indeed two cultures, but not the way he divides them.
Oh, would you explain that?
He would say that there is one that depends on science and one that depends on the humanities. They shall never meet and they're bound to diverge. No such thing. There are two types of culture. One, a pragmatic type, practical affair, the culture that has to do with earning a living in the world and working with organizations and generally advancing the public benefit. And that includes, on the one hand, a knowledge of things, that is science, and a knowledge of men, the humanities. And only when those are merged do you get a man who is truly cultured. But having said that, there is beyond that a second type of culture that has nothing whatever to do with practicality. Music, art, literature, the study of things for the sake of knowing about them, with no practical utility. Even such a thing as appreciating the sparkle of sun on a brook in the woods or the flight of a gull. That's all culture, and culture of the higher sort. Now, you can't teach that kind of culture. You can exemplify it. You can teach the techniques that underlie it. But it is merely natural to a man who is living a full life. No man lives fully unless he partakes in one way or another of that second type of culture.
So there is no unbridgeable gap between two cultures, you
No
feel?
unbridgeable gap between those two cultures, and there are no such things as the two cultures that C.P. Snow talks about.
Very interesting. Well, Dr. Bush, having been aware of what's important in science and technology and engineering in the past and being very much aware of what's going on at the present time, I wonder if you would speak for a moment or two about what you feel are the significant advances that have been made.
Oh, there are so many of them. You see, there are more scientists working today than were alive in the whole history of the race. And science is going ahead on 100 fronts at an accelerated pace, moving so fast that it's hard to keep up with the affair, and an advance that would have been regarded as spectacular a couple of decades ago, or 3 decades ago, may now be made and hardly be noticed because there is so much happening. But you can say this in general, that the physical sciences made a great burst during the war, a great step forward after the war, and their applications flowed in great number because the basic science, the fundamental science, had been done and was ready to be applied. Now we have a similar thing today in biology. A great mass of fundamental knowledge built up so that one day a dam will break, and this will begin to be applied in 1,000 ways with results that no man can predict. I think that's the most exciting thing that lies ahead.
This fundamental knowledge you refer to as the new understanding of the genetic code? And
well, that's one thing, but understanding of life generally. And of course, mentioning the genetic code, I think this business of breaking the genetic code is one of the most intriguing and exciting things that's going on today in science.
Why do you say that?
Well, here we have a gene. You've got a few of them inside you. And when you were born, or conceived rather, they proceeded to dictate how your body would be formed. They did it by sending out messages to tell what cells to do what. The language that they used was a coded language. We are now breaking that code, translating their language so that we can read the language of the genes. Now you can see what that might lead to.
Yes, it certainly might. There are a lot of implications in just understanding it.
Oh, yes. But it's not hard to understand, and many a man who was a layman, lawyer, a physician or something, gets great pleasure out of following that particular advance because it's very intriguing indeed. There are dozens of laboratories working on it, you know. One finds out one little thing, and then somebody puts it all together, and gradually this whole thing is being translated.
Yes, I think one physician that I talked to marveled at it more because it was as though it had finally unlocked the real secret that gotten down to the basic essentials.
But all the way through biology, there are all sorts of things going on. We're getting a whole new understanding of physiology. The work that's being done on the way in which the nerves operate is fascinating. And the relations, the resemblances between the brain's operations and the operations of a modern analytical machine is a fascinating aspect of it.
Speaking of analytical machines, this is something that you pioneered in. What do you think about the present-day computer and perhaps its role in our future?
Well, you said a minute ago that there was so much happening in the world that it'd probably be impossible to understand it or keep up with it. Well, that would be true if it wasn't for the fact that we have far better means of understanding than we used to have. Far better media of communication, far better ways of presenting things, including the little job that you and I are doing, I hope. And that's helping a great deal. But as time goes on, the analytical machine, which will supplement a man's thinking methods, which will think for him, will have as great an effect on his grasp of the world and his access to data and so on, his manipulation of it. will have as great an effect in that way as the invention of the machine way back took the load off of men by giving them mechanical power instead of the power of their muscles.
Do you see no dangers in the increasing reliance on the machine to think for us? Is it?
No, I don't see any. Once in a while, somebody that likes to write for spectacular purposes will talk about a race of self-reproducing machines that will take over civilization, banish humanity, like the old Frankenstein story. Well, we still believe in fairy tales, but they're amusing, but that's all.
Of course, computers are closely related to automation. How do you feel about
Very
that
closely.
effect?
Well, automation makes quite a problem. We have to realize 2 or 3 things in looking at that problem. First, they say that every time you automate, you throw men out of work. Well, that's not absolutely true, because every time you automate, you have to give employment to a lot of men to build and repair, install, and correct the automation. Rather, it's more clear to say that when you automate, you create skilled jobs and obsolete unskilled jobs. And that does indeed make a problem. But we also have to think of this, that it's not, well, temporary dislocations are sad and we have to contend with them and so forth. And we have to prevent people from being thrown into distress through no fault of their own. Having said all of that, it's not a calamity if we learn to make all the things we need for our civilized existence with less effort on our parts.
Do you see then a greater leisure time for all of
Sure, certainly. Although I'm not at all sure what the American public's going to do with more leisure.
Oh, that may be the real problem then?
Well, it may be. But I've got a good deal of faith in the American public. They do some awfully queer things. But once in a while, they show their real caliber. And I'll tell you one time when they did, when it cheered me up good for another many years. That was when they endorsed and backed the Marshall Plan. The first time that any nation ever came voluntarily to the succor of other nations to see that they were helped out of the aftermath of the war. It was a magnificent thing to do, and the American public was behind it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bush. We've been visiting Dr. Vannevar Bush at his home in Belmont, Massachusetts. This is John Fitch, MIT science reporter.
This is NET, National Educational Television.